Introduction. Smoke in the hills. In the rugged frontier town of Redstone, justice rides on dust-choked trails and echoes through the canyons with the crack of gunfire. This is a land where the law is often outpaced by violence, and survival depends on grit, loyalty, and the strength to stand when others fall. Smoke in the hills begins in the shadow of a dying sun, where a former Pinkerton agent, Maria Vega, and a sharp-eyed sharpshooter, Annie McGraw, hold their ground against a gang of outlaws led by the infamous Will Cassidy. What starts as a standoff in a ravine soon spirals into a relentless pursuit across the unforgiving terrain of the West. But this is more than a tale of bullets and bounty. It's a story of people, of Marshal Elias Grey, a man of quiet resolve, of Walker Wiley, ex-bounty hunter turned sheriff with a restless heart, of Emily Batten, a rancher with fire in her spirit, and of Caleb Boone, a tracker who finds more than footprints in the dust. As the Cassidy gang unravels, new bonds are forged, old wounds are tested, and the town of Redstone begins to rise from the ashes of fear. This is a Western where justice is earned, not given, where love grows in the spaces between danger and duty, and where every trail leads not just to a reckoning, but to redemption. Welcome to Redstone. The hunt begins here. Chapter 1. Smoke in the Hills. The sun had dipped below the jagged ridgeline, casting long shadows across the ravine where Maria Vega and Annie McGraw crouched behind a cluster of boulders. Gunpowder hung thick in the air, the echo of gunfire still bouncing off the canyon walls. Below them, Will Cassidy and two of his men had taken cover behind rocks and fallen logs, their campfire now a smoldering heap of ash. Maria reloaded her revolver with practiced speed, her jaw clenched. "He's wounded," she whispered to Annie, who was crouched beside her, rifle in hand. "I clipped his arm. He won't be able to ride far." Annie nodded, her freckled face streaked with dust. "We've got the high ground. If we press now, we might be able to take them." Maria shook her head. "Not yet. Cassidy's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. We wait for Elias and the others to circle back. We can't take all three alone." Below, Cassidy barked orders to his men, his voice tight with pain. "Get the horses ready. We're not dying in this canyon." One of his men, a lanky outlaw with a crooked nose, peeked over the rock and fired a wild shot toward the ridge. The bullet struck the stone near Annie's shoulder, sending a spray of rock chips into the air. Annie ducked, heart pounding. "They're trying to break out." Maria narrowed her eyes. "Let them try." Meanwhile, miles to the west, Elias Grey, Walker Wiley, and Doc Harlan had just finished securing the three captured outlaws near the river. The men sat bound beneath a cottonwood tree, their expressions sullen and silent. Elias stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the fading trail that led back toward the hills. "Cassidy's not with them," he said. Maria was right. "He went north." Walker adjusted his saddle, his face grim. "Then we ride. If we push hard, we can reach them by morning." Doc Harlan, older but still sharp, checked the bindings on the prisoners. "These three won't be going anywhere. Let's hope the girls haven't gotten themselves into more trouble than they can handle." Elias mounted his horse, his voice low but resolute. "They can handle more than most men I know. But Cassidy's slippery. We need to end this before he disappears again." Back in the ravine, the standoff stretched into the night. The moon rose high, casting a pale glow over the canyon. Maria and Annie remained hidden, watching as Cassidy's men grew restless. Then, without warning, Cassidy made his move. A sudden burst of gunfire erupted from below as Cassidy and his men mounted their horses and charged toward the narrow pass at the far end of the ravine. Maria fired, striking one of the horses in the leg. The animal bucked and collapsed, sending its rider tumbling to the ground. Annie took aim and fired, her shot grazing the shoulder of the second outlaw. But Cassidy, wounded and furious, pushed his horse hard, disappearing into the shadows beyond the pass. Maria stood, her revolver still smoking. "He's running." Annie looked down at the fallen outlaw, who groaned and clutched his leg. "One down, one wounded. But Cassidy's still out there." Maria holstered her weapon. "We'll track him at first light. He's bleeding. He won't get far." By dawn, Elias and the rest of the posse had reached the ravine. Maria and Annie met them at the edge, their faces tired but determined. "He got away," Maria said without preamble. "But he's hurt. We've got one of his men alive, and the other's not going anywhere." Elias dismounted, his eyes scanning the trail Cassidy had taken. "Then we ride again. This ends today." Walker looked to Maria. "You sure you're up for another chase?" Maria gave a tight nod. "I didn't come all this way to let Cassidy slip through our fingers." Annie, brushing dust from her coat, added, "He's not getting away. Not this time." Elias looked at the group, tired, bruised, but unbroken. "Then let's finish this." As the posse rode out once more, the rising sun lit the hills in gold and fire. The hunt for Will Cassidy was far from over, but Redstone's defenders were closing in. And this time, they wouldn't stop until justice was done. Chapter 2. The Hunt Tightens. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the lingering tang of gunpowder. Maria Vega adjusted her hat against the glare of the rising sun, her eyes scanning the trail ahead. The posse had split into two groups. Elias, Maria, and Annie took the northern ridge, while Walker and Doc Harlan followed the canyon floor, keeping an eye out for any sign of Cassidy's trail. Maria's horse snorted, its breath visible in the cool air. She patted its neck absently, her mind focused on the task ahead. Cassidy was wounded, and his horse couldn't have carried him far. But the man was cunning, and she knew better than to underestimate him. "Tracks are fresh," Elias said, dismounting to inspect the ground. He crouched low, running his fingers over the disturbed dirt. "Blood drops here. He's sticking to the rocky terrain to slow us down, but he's leaving a trail." Annie leaned forward in her saddle, her rifle resting across her lap. "He's smart, but he's desperate. He'll make a mistake." Maria nodded, her jaw tight. "He already has. He should have stayed hidden in the canyon. Out here, he's got nowhere to run." Elias stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Let's keep moving. If we push hard, we can catch him before he reaches the timberline." The group pressed on, the sound of hooves crunching against gravel echoing through the hills. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill. As they rode, Maria's thoughts drifted to the events of the previous night. The gunfire, the chaos, the look of fury on Cassidy's face as he fled into the darkness. She had been chasing him for months, ever since he and his gang had raided the Redstone Bank, leaving 3 dead and a town full of shattered lives. This wasn't just about justice. For Maria, it was personal. "Hold up," Elias said, raising a hand. He pointed to a cluster of boulders ahead, where a faint trail of blood led it into a narrow crevice. "He might have holed up in there." Maria dismounted, drawing her revolver. "I'll check it out." Annie slid off her horse, rifle at the ready. "I'm coming with you." Elias nodded, his expression grim. "Be careful. If he's in there, he's cornered, and that makes him dangerous." The two women moved cautiously toward the crevice, their weapons drawn. The air inside was cool and damp, the faint smell of earth and decay filling their nostrils. Maria's boots crunched softly against the ground as she advanced, her eyes scanning every shadow. "See anything?" Annie whispered, her voice barely audible. Maria shook her head, her grip tightening on her revolver. "Not yet." Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the crevice as a bullet ricocheted off the rock near Maria's head. She dropped to the ground, returning fire instinctively. Annie dove behind a boulder, her rifle snapping up to her shoulder. "Cassidy!" Maria shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. "You're done! There's nowhere left to run!" A low, pained laugh came from deeper within the crevice. "You think you've won, Vega?" Cassidy's voice was hoarse, laced with both anger and exhaustion. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Maria's jaw clenched. "I know enough. You're bleeding out, and your men are either dead or captured. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see a trial." Another shot rang out, striking the rock near Annie's cover. She fired back, her bullet sparking against the stone. "He's stalling," Annie said, her voice tight. "Trying to buy time." Maria nodded, her mind racing. Cassidy was cornered, but he was still dangerous. They couldn't afford to rush him, not without backup. She glanced over her shoulder, hoping to see Elias, but the crevice was too narrow for him to follow on horseback. "Stay here," Maria said to Annie. "Keep him pinned down. I'll circle around and cut off his escape." Annie hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." Maria slipped out of the crevice, moving quickly but quietly along the rocks. She knew Cassidy well enough to predict his moves. He was a survivor, always looking for the next way out. If there was even a slim chance of escape, he'd take it. As she climbed higher, the landscape opened up before her, revealing a narrow path that led out of the crevice and into the hills beyond. And there, limping along the trail, was Cassidy. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood staining his shirt, but he still clutched a revolver in his right hand. Maria raised her weapon, her voice steady. "It's over, Cassidy. Drop the gun." Cassidy froze, his shoulders heaving with labored breaths. Slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes burning with defiance. "You think you're the hero here, Vega? You think this ends with me?" Maria's grip tightened on her revolver. "Drop it, now!" For a moment, Cassidy seemed to consider his options. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he raised his gun. Maria fired first, her shot striking him in the chest. Cassidy staggered, his weapon falling from his hand as he collapsed to the ground. Maria approached cautiously, her revolver still trained on him. Cassidy's breaths were shallow, his eyes glassy. He looked up at her, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. "You'll never stop it," he rasped. Redstone was just the beginning. Maria knelt beside him, her expression hard. "What are you talking about?" But Cassidy didn't answer. His eyes closed, and his body went still. By the time Elias and Annie reached her, Maria was standing over Cassidy's body, her revolver holstered. She looked at them, her face unreadable. "It's done," she said simply. Elias nodded, his gaze shifting to Cassidy's lifeless form. "Let's get back to town. There's still work to do." As the posse rode back toward Redstone, Maria couldn't shake Cassidy's final words. Redstone was just the beginning. What had he meant? And what dangers still lingered in the shadows? The hills were quiet now, but Maria knew the peace wouldn't last. Chapter 3. Sparks in the Dust. The sun hung low over Redstone, casting long golden rays across the dusty main street. The town was quiet in the aftermath of the Cassidy gang's downfall, but attention still lingered, like the land itself was holding its breath. The posse had returned as heroes, but the work of rebuilding trust and order had only just begun. Maria Vega stood outside the sheriff's office, arms crossed, watching the townsfolk go about their business. Her hat was tilted low, shielding her eyes from the sun, but she wasn't really watching the street. She was thinking about Cassidy's final words, about the trail of blood they'd followed, and about the man who had ridden beside her through it all. Walker Wiley leaned against the hitching post a few feet away, his hat pushed back and a lazy grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd been watching Maria for a while, waiting for the right moment. She was a hard woman to read, sharp, guarded, and always a step ahead. But there was something in her eyes now, something softer. "You always stare at people like that, or am I just lucky?" Maria asked without turning. Walker chuckled. "Only when they're worth looking at." She glanced at him, one brow raised. "That line work on all the women you chase, or just the ones with guns?" "Only the ones who shoot better than I do," he said, pushing off the post and stepping closer. "Which, far as I can tell, is just you." Maria smirked, but didn't look away. "You're not as smooth as you think, Wiley." "Maybe not," he said, his voice dropping just a touch. "But I'm persistent." Before she could answer, Marshal Elias stepped out of the office, a stack of papers in hand. He paused, eyeing the two of them with a knowing look. "Maria, Walker," he said. "Glad to see you're both still standing. Emily's hosting a supper at the Big B tonight. Says it's her way of thanking everyone who helped bring Cassidy down." Maria nodded. "I'll be there." Walker tipped his hat. "Wouldn't miss it." Elias gave them a faint smile. "Good. And Maria, might be worth talking to Emily about what Cassidy said. She's got ears in places most folks don't." As Elias walked off, Maria turned back to Walker. You going to that supper to eat or just to follow me around? Can it be both? He said, grinning. She rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. You're impossible. And yet, here you are still talking to me. That night, the Big B Ranch was lit up with lanterns and laughter. Long tables were set out under the stars, and the smell of roasted beef and fresh bread filled the air. Emily Batten, tall and commanding in a deep blue dress, moved through the crowd like a queen surveying her court. Her parents, Pastor Devon and Angela, welcomed guests with warm smiles and heaping plates. Maria arrived in a clean shirt and her hair tied back, her revolver still at her hip. She wasn't one for parties, but something about the open air and the sound of music made her feel lighter. Walker found her near the edge of the crowd, 2 tin cups in hand. He offered her one. Figured you might need something to take the edge off, he said. She took the cup, sniffed it, and raised an eyebrow. Apple cider? He shrugged. Didn't figure you for the whiskey type. Not tonight, anyway. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as Emily danced barefoot in the grass with Caleb Boone, her blonde hair flying wild in the wind. Doc Harlan sat nearby, chuckling with Angela over a plate of pie. You ever think about settling down? Walker asked suddenly. Maria looked at him, surprised. You? He laughed. I asked you first. She took a sip of cider, then looked out at the hills. I used to think I'd never stop moving. Always another case, another trail. But lately, I don't know. Maybe I'm tired of running. Walker nodded slowly. I know the feeling. Been chasing bounties so long, I forgot what it's like to stay in one place. But Redstone's got a pull to it, and maybe so do you. Maria turned to him, her expression unreadable. You're serious. I am, he said, stepping closer. I know you're not the type to be wooed with flowers and sweet talk, but I've seen you fight, seen you lead, and I'd be a fool not to want to ride beside you wherever that leads. She studied him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Then don't be a fool, Wiley, she said softly. Just don't expect me to go easy on you. He grinned. Wouldn't have it any other way. As the music swelled and the stars brightened overhead, Maria and Walker stood together at the edge of the celebration, 2 warriors finding something unexpected in the quiet between battles. And for the first time in a long while, Maria Vega let herself hope. Chapter 4. Trial in Redstone. The Redstone courthouse was a modest building, whitewashed wood, a tall front porch, and a bell that hadn't rung since the last spring flood. But today it stood as the heart of the town, filled with townsfolk eager to see justice done. The Cassidy gang's reign of fear had ended, and now the people wanted closure. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The pews were packed, the murmurs of conversation hushed, as the doors creaked open, and Judge Mallory Wiley stepped up to the bench. She was a woman of quiet authority, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, her dark eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She shared a last name with Sheriff Walker Wiley. They were brother and sister, but her reputation was her own, forged in courtrooms from Abilene to Santa Fe. She rapped her gavel once, and the room fell silent. This court is now in session, she said, her voice calm but firm. We are here to hear the charges against the remaining members of the Cassidy gang, Jedediah Crane and Thomas Slim Rourke, on counts of robbery, attempted murder, and conspiracy. The 2 outlaws sat at the defense table, shackled and sullen. Jedediah's arm was in a sling, his face pale from the wound he'd taken in the ravine. Slim Rourke stared at the floor, jaw clenched, as if trying to disappear into the wood. Marshal Elias Grey stood to present the case, his badge gleaming in the morning light. Your Honor, these men were captured during the pursuit of Will Cassidy, who led the raid on Redstone's bank and left 3 citizens dead. These 2 aided him directly, and we have testimony from multiple witnesses, including former Pinkerton agent Maria Vega and Sheriff Walker Wiley. Judge Wiley nodded. Proceed. As the trial unfolded, Maria took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted the ambush in the ravine, the gunfire, and the final chase. Walker followed, his tone more relaxed, but no less convincing. The townsfolk listened with rapt attention, many of them still shaken by the memory of Cassidy's crimes. When the defense tried to argue that the men had been coerced by Cassidy, Judge Wiley raised a single brow. You had a choice, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. And you chose violence. By midday, the verdict was clear. The jury returned swiftly, and Judge Wiley delivered the sentence with quiet finality. Jedediah Crane and Thomas Rourke, you are hereby sentenced to hang until dead 3 days from now. May this serve as a warning to those who would bring lawlessness to Redstone. The gavel fell and the room exhaled as one. Outside the courthouse, the sun was high and warm, and the mood had shifted. Justice had been served, and the town could begin to heal. Caleb Boone leaned against the hitching post, his hat tilted back, watching the townsfolk disperse. He spotted Emily Batten stepping down from the courthouse steps, her riding skirt catching the breeze, her expression thoughtful. You looked mighty serious in there, he said, pushing off the post and falling into step beside her. Emily glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. It's not every day you see justice done so cleanly. Judge Wiley doesn't waste words. No, ma'am, she doesn't, Caleb said, tipping his hat. But I reckon you don't either. Emily laughed softly. Is that your way of saying I'm intimidating? Not at all, he said, grinning. Just observant. You've got a way of looking at people like you already know what they're going to say. Maybe I do, she said, her eyes twinkling. And maybe I'm still trying to figure you out, Caleb Boone. He chuckled. Well, I'm not that complicated. I track things, I ride fast, and I've been known to enjoy a good peach pie. Emily raised an eyebrow. Is that your idea of a courtship pitch? Depends, he said, stepping a little closer. Is it working? She paused, then smiled. Ask me again after supper. I might have a pie cooling on the windowsill. Caleb touched the brim of his hat. Then I'll be there, Miss Batten. Wouldn't miss it. As the two walked down the street, the courthouse behind them and the future ahead, Redstone felt, for the first time in a long while, like a town on the mend. Justice had been served, hearts were beginning to open, and in the quiet spaces between duty and danger, something new was beginning to bloom.
Thanks for riding along, partner. If you enjoyed this tale from the wild frontier, give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your aim true.